Hello, everybody. I'm Gabriela Safran from the Slavic department, and I have the privilege of introducing our speaker for today. He is Eddy Portnoy, a senior researcher and exhibition curator at YIVO, the Institute for Jewish Research in New York City, one of the most important centers of Yiddish documents and studies in the world. Eddy Portnoy, who was just telling me about his dissertation on cartoons, wrote a PhD dissertation at JTS, and has moved from there to be a kind of scholar who does this thing that we all kind of wish we could do, but we don't, which is to speak to a broad audience really effectively and simultaneously to an academic audience in a way that academics totally respect and want to do, but aren't successful at. He wrote a 2017 book that was published at Stanford Press. Stanford Press is, I'm actually on a committee for Stanford Press, so I get to hear a lot about some of their favorite books, and they include this one. It is Bad Rabbi and Other Strange but True Stories from the Yiddish Press. So a wonderful, amazing book. This book talks about the life of what Portnoy calls downwardly mobile Jews. So we have a kind of narrative of how Jews are, a model minority and upwardly mobile and so on. And that's not true of all of them. And if you look carefully at the Yiddish press, you see all kinds of other stories which we tend to elide, but which we should, in fact, attend to. We should notice them. Portnoy also he attends in this way, I think, to aspects of life that are not always sort of front and center in thinking about academic writing, right? Like we tend to think, okay, I'm just writing for this narrow audience, and what Eddy does is also create these exhibits at YIVO, which speak to a much larger non-academic audience, and that allow us to see the kind of ordinary life, the non-intellectual life of Jews in the past. In thinking about what I would say today, I went to the Wikipedia page about our speaker, and it has this wonderful line. Portnoy is considered Helm's leading expert on Yiddish humor.
I have to say that I did not write that.
That was my question.
So that Wikipedia page was apparently created by someone in Poland. And it was subsequently edited by someone else from I don't know where, but I saw that and I figured I had never touched that. I didn't create it, and I thought that should just be left as it is.
It should be left as it is,
yeah.
And it's so perfect because it's like this example of the kind of pop culture that exists and is out there, and we should attend to it, and we don't have to judge it. But we should notice it, right? So anyway, I give you Helm's leading expert on Yiddish humor. Today, Portnoy will speak in English about the Yiddish press, Headless body found in topless bars, sensationalism and scandal in the Yiddish press. Tomorrow, he will speak again in Yiddish at noon about this amazing Yiddish puppet theater. So if you know Yiddish, maybe even if you don't know Yiddish, come to that talk. The one thing left for me to do is to thank the sponsors of this talk. So this talk is sponsored, of course, and organized by the Taube Center here at Stanford. It is also co-sponsored by CREEES, the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, by the History Department here, and by UC Berkeley's Jewish Studies program. I should also say that this talk is part of our annual series, the Clara Sumpf lecture series, that every year includes a lecture in English and a lecture in Yiddish. It is distinctive. No one else does this. And I actually was very privileged in that I got to know Clara Sumpf, and I even taught her. She sat in on my class when I had just arrived at Stanford, and she was an amazing presence and had these amazing stories, and some of them did involve New York culture, New York Jewish culture in the earlier parts of the 20th century, and possibly even some downwardly mobile Jews, and some humor. And so I think she would really appreciate the talk we're going to hear today. Let us welcome our speaker.
Thanks so much, Gabriella. And thanks obviously also to the sponsors, to Clara Sumpf and her family for doing this, and to the Taube Center and the History Department, Slavic Studies Department, whoever else in Berkeley who I guess had to get involved, which was nice of them. And thanks to all of you for coming. And as Gabriella mentioned, a lot of my work has to do with downwardly mobile Jews, and this does also to a large degree. So from its beginnings in the 19th century, the popular press has wrangled with the need to sell its product, produce income from advertisements, and to report the news in an accurate and honest fashion. These three categories sometimes find themselves in conflict with one another. These conflicts appear in all presses, from big city to small town, as well as in all countries, with the exception of perhaps state-run presses, which present other issues to deal with. And as one might expect, the conflict between sales and forthrightness often results in the latter taking a backseat to the former, and is often manifested in the production of what we'd call sensationalistic news copy, the stories of which are sometimes strange but true, sometimes embellished, and occasionally fabricated outright. This phenomenon began during the first half of the 19th century in the American newspaper industry. In George Jurgen's study of Joseph Pulitzer, he defined sensationalism as, quote, the strategy of attracting a large audience by concentrating on stories of timeless appeal, sex, crime, tragedy, end quote. Now, the Yiddish popular press in North America, with the beginnings of which occurred at the end of the 19th century, provided their audience with a wide variety of fare, which ranged from international, national, and local news, a fair amount of which was focused on Jewish issues, as you'd expect, but also included opinion and advice columns, literature which ranged from high quality to pulp, literary and theater criticism, and information specific to immigrants, among a variety of other topics. The early days of this press, up through the end of World War I, saw the inclusion of eye-catching headlines below which sat sensationalistic stories, many of which revealed unusual or unseemly aspects of Jewish life, the same stories that Jurgens calls of timeless appeal, sex, crime, and tragedy. Considered a problem by critics, such articles were firstly an embarrassment to the Jewish community, and secondly, ugly reminders of what was really of interest to average newspaper readers. Whatever one's opinion of them, they nonetheless represent the Yiddish version of populist newspaper sensationalism. Now, I want to look at a few examples from the Vorwärts, which was the largest and most successful Yiddish newspaper in history. So this one appeared on January 28th, 1914. The article that I'm discussing is outlined in black. And it's obviously above the fold. And it reads as follows. The residents of 111 Essex Street and all of its nearby neighbors were abruptly awoken in the middle of the night by loud screams and the police, who they saw arresting Mrs. Greenberg of 111 Essex along with her boarder, Isidore Glassman. Both were brought to the station house. The trouble was apparently caused by Mr. Greenberg, who, according to neighbors, has a tendency to stick his nose in other people's business. Mr. and Mrs. Greenberg of 111 Essex split up 4 years ago. Mrs. Greenberg stayed put, and her ex-husband left to make his way in Philadelphia. They allegedly remained on friendly terms, and Mr. Greenberg would occasionally visit his ex-wife. Unfortunately, he paid one of these visits late last Tuesday night and caught the former Mrs. Greenberg in bed with her boarder, 28-year-old Isidore Glassman. Mr. Greenberg was furious and began lashing out at his ex-wife and her boarder. But with 2 against 1, it wasn't going to be a fair fight, and Glassman and Mrs. Greenberg really began to give it to her ex-husband. All of this fighting created a huge amount of noise and woke up the surrounding tenement houses, and someone called the police, who came and arrested Glassman and the boarder and the former Mrs. Greenberg. So I would provide another example from a few years prior, from September 19th, 1907, which reports on a variety of untoward activities connected to the holiday of Yom Kippur. And you can see this one outlined in red at the bottom. And unfortunately, this one is one of my favorites, and maybe you've heard it before. Yom Kippur services in a Clinton Street hall were disrupted due to a fight over a chair. When Joseph Rand showed up in Shul with his family, he discovered that one Herman Garber was sitting in one of the seats he had reserved. Rand informed Garber that he was in one of his seats, but Garber produced a ticket indicating that Rand was wrong and that it was, in fact, his seat. Rand responded by punching Garber in the face. Not to be outdone, Garber tore out part of Rand's beard. The lion-like voice of the cantor was drowned out by the screams and howls of the fighting congregants. In the end, both Rand and Garber were forced to finish the Musaf service in Essex Market Court, where they were both held under arrest. So, should these articles, both of which appeared on the front page of the forwards, be considered examples of media sensationalism? I think it really depends on who you ask. I want to show you what the second one looks like in situ. So you see where it sits on the page, but I want you to see what else is on the page. So you can see the headlines of the different articles. He blamed his blind mother for his father's death. 30 furrier bossers settled with the union. He was beaten and robbed on Madison Street. A rooster with a wooden leg. Pogrom wasn't so bad, according to Telegram. Yom Kippur pogroms in Brownsville and Providence, and that's under the rubric that the article that I read falls. And then female boarder replaces the missus and is shot. So during its first 2 decades, the Vorwärts, the best-selling and most successful Yiddish newspaper, was repeatedly accused by critics and ideological opponents of catering to the basest interests of its readership, of filling the paper with bad literature, vulgar advice columns, as well as questionable reportage. All of these allegations, to some degree, happen to be true. But at the same time, this newspaper also provided readers with excellent literature, superb historical and political pieces, finely honed editorials, and high-quality reportage. When critics derided the Vorwärts as a producer of Schund, or sensationalistic trash, they typically pointed to popular columns like Jente Telebende or the Bintelbrief, and this is what the Bintelbrief, a bundle of letters, very popular advice column, looked like. They considered these journalistic sleights of hand created in order to garner higher circulation. Among the things they complained about was also this almost daily column that began in 1909 called A Gallery of Missing Men, which almost every day from 1909 really through the 20s and 30s showcased photographs and descriptions of men who had abandoned their wives and families. And this was a big draw for people to come and look at their neighbors who, had done something terrible. Now, these criticisms were often coupled with the accusation that the editors had developed these crass columns in order to gain a bigger readership and generate more advertising revenue. Worse yet, by engaging in these activities, the paper had betrayed the socialist ideals it so often trumpeted. Another aspect that critics abhorred was the appearance of articles on what were often gruesome or violent local crime stories, material that really could be found in any newspaper in any language, the difference here being that those appeared in the Yiddish press generally involved Jews, which of course was the constituency. While the lurid and sensationalistic nature of such reportage certainly brought complaints, this criticism also seems to have been due to embarrassment on the part of the critics and intellectuals to the airing of Jews behaving badly in a public forum. It's this latter element that has consistently been one of the most problematic issues when charges of sensationalism come to light in connection to the Yiddish press. Now, this whole issue is probably best evoked in a 1914 cartoon that appeared in Der Grösser Kundis, a satirical weekly that was one of the fiercest critics of the Yiddish press. And this is that cartoon. Now, the cartoon portrays Abraham Kahn, the editor of the Vorwärts, and the most powerful and politically connected Jewish figure on the Lower East Side trying to shield himself from a blizzard of actual dated headlines cut and pasted from the pages of his newspaper. Among them are headlines such as, "Young thief forces women to strip naked," "Sinful young women riot in a private home," "He kept a wife on Henry Street and a mistress on Norfolk." And one of my favorites, and this is tough to translate into English, but in Yiddish it's "Peddler von Altwarg antläuft mit Jungwarg," which means, it's a word play, but it basically means a peddler from old things, or really secondhand goods, but a peddler from old things runs off with new things. So the idea is that he's run off with some young woman. Now these headlines fall into the category of what Kahn's critic referred to in Yiddish as shund, which, as I mentioned, is trashy sensationalism. A type of prurient reportage about Jewish criminals and ne'er-do-wells, these stories were often situated on the front page amid reports on more serious news items such as general and national news, pogroms abroad, and local union activity, and functioned as a kind of journalistic treat meant to draw the reader and keep them interested. In spite of the occasionally lurid nature and the frequent criticisms of intellectuals, these seemingly insignificant stories nonetheless reveal aspects of Jewish history that have largely been ignored by historians. So Jewish history, like most other histories, is largely about elites. Rabbis, scholars, writers, artists, politicians, business people all fill the rosters of Jewish history books. There's also been a more recent focus on social history, but these often have an upwardly mobile trajectory. And just as an example, I can think of, let's say, Hasia Diner's book, recent book on peddlers, where immigrant starts as a peddler in the street, works his way up to owning a small shop, buys a bigger shop, and then winds up owning a department store. This is the upwardly mobile trajectory that I'm talking about. And so there are many, many stories on the successes of Jewish individuals, particularly in recent centuries. But what, as Gabrielle mentioned, about these downwardly mobile Jews? What about those who failed in their endeavors? There are surely far more of them than success stories. Early 20th century Yiddish newspapers are full of stories of immigrant Jews involved in scandals, failures, and disasters. Why have historians so assiduously avoided the topic? The Yom Kippur Report I read, and the one about the Greenbergs as well, these represent a little-known but eminently interesting corner of Jewish history whose main vehicle was the Yiddish press. Now, one little infrequently addressed aspect of this press is that there are sensationalistic aspects to it, even in its earlier days. The first Yiddish newspaper to appear in the Russian Empire, Kol Mevasser, and you can see that here, did so in 1862. While this newspaper is largely discussed in historiography as a vehicle for modern Yiddish literature, it is only ever mentioned in passing how radical this literature was for its audience. From Mendele Moicher Sforim's Das kleine Menschele to Yitzchak Yoel Linetsky's Das Polische Yingel, stories that have since come to be considered classics of Yiddish literature, readers of this paper were presented with stories that mocked and excoriated their lifestyles and their traditions. Each week, a new shocking chapter would appear in the paper. So consider, for example, Linetsky's description of a trip to the mikveh or the ritual bath as a child. And I'm quoting, "All at once my father seizes my hand and takes me down some 30 or 40 narrow, crooked, broken, slippery steps, down into a dank, dark, deep pit, chock full of naked, slimy people shoving back and forth. Adults. Do you get it? Adults. Not boys my own age. Every time one of those adults touches me, I feel a sickening disgust, too horrible for words. And in the midst of those ghastly, fearful ordeals, my father grabs both my hands like a demon, a klutz, and hurls me into the water with all his might and main. I had no idea what was happening to me. I kept wriggling like a poisoned mouse, kicking and flailing as if looking for my soul in the darkness. Can you, dear readers, picture my terror?" At the time this appeared in 1867, most of the popular reading material available in Yiddish consisted of moralistic chapbooks. So how did readers respond to this lurid description of what was a weekly tradition for most of them? For many of them, this was doubtlessly considered humorous fare, and although it had the potential to be offensive, readers kept coming back for more. And as a book, Das Polnische Jingle became an early Yiddish bestseller. Sensation and shock were part of modern Yiddish literature from its earliest days, yet scholarship has accepted this wave of biting satire almost as a naturally occurring phenomenon in Jewish literary life without much consideration of reception. The lesser-known material in Kolma Wasser, articles on history and science, were equally as startling to the Jews residing in the Pale of Settlement. Appearing in October 1862, the first article on the first issue's front page was about the American Civil War, probably the first time readers in the Pale of Settlement had read anything about it. The article described America as a new country that had no king, elected its leaders, was a place where they didn't care if you were a Jew or a Christian, and which was entirely run by businessmen. So this seems still to be true somewhat. Now, Kolma Wasser brought all kinds of new and sensational information to the Jews scattered throughout the small shtetl in the Pale. Take, for example, the third issue, which appeared in November 1862. An article was printed about the giant sequoia trees in California. This was doubtlessly the first time that readers of Yiddish had ever heard of such a thing. Described to them as being 8,000 to 10,000 years old and tallest than the tallest tower and wider than the widest house they'd ever seen, such trees must have seemed impossible to readers who knew very little about the United States or even the natural world or natural sciences. And in fact, about a month later, the paper published a letter from a reader that elucidated the situation. He wrote, "Dear editor, I very much like your newspaper, and I was especially interested in the article on these giant trees in California. I think, however, you must have made a mistake. Because how could a tree be 8,000 to 10,000 years old when the world itself is only 5,623 years old?" So in a nutshell, this episode explains both the breadth of knowledge of Jews in the shtetl and also the way in which the newspaper completely exploded their worldviews. As the Yiddish press developed during the late 19th century, it would continue to provide Jews with a plethora of information that would serve to change both them and their culture. In short, as scholars Sarah Stein and Nati Cohen have contended, newspapers helped to make Jews modern, or at least brought news of modernity into their homes and allowed them to figure out what to do with it. Additionally, emerging from a culture for which the written word enjoyed a venerated status, writing and writers would play an enormously important role in the modernization and the secularization of Jews. Concerning the role of the writer in modern Jewish society during the early 20th century, Yiddish critic Dr. Alexander Mukdoini wrote, quoting, "The writer had become a kind of rabbi, a new rabbi, not one that takes queries for payments, not one who gives blessings and advice, but one who teaches. He says something new, something beautiful, something electrifying," end quote. Now, while this quote is, in Mukdoini's quote case, especially somewhat self-serving, writers and journalists were, in fact, part of a new intellectual class that, for an increasingly secular Jewry, was supplanting rabbis as a communal authority. Now, as a reflection of Jewish life from the 1880s through the 1930s, there is no better resource than Yiddish-language newspapers. Everything about Jewish life appears in them, from internal and external Jewish politics, history, science, commerce, literature, poetry, opinion, to news about Yiddish theater, Jewish sports teams, and religious matters, to neighborhood news that include small, hyper-localized stories like the ones I read at the beginning. The first form of popular mass media among Jews, there were, for example, more Yiddish newspapers per capita than for other linguistic minorities in the United States, where, in fact, the Yiddish press was the largest foreign language press in the country's history. For a small minority, Jews produced a remarkable number of newspapers during the early 20th century. 5 daily newspapers in New York, 4 dailies in Warsaw, and dozens in other cities and shtetl on all continents, not to mention the hundreds of weekly and monthly periodicals on incredibly diverse topics. From the late 19th to the mid-20th centuries, this was a large and significant press. Highly politicized, it was also an extremely contentious one. So within this universe of Yiddish periodicals, what of the charge of sensationalism? As Nati Cohen observes, there were in fact actual tabloids in Poland during the interwar period that could be conceived of as sensationalistic, with large and blaring front page headlines that were designed to sell papers off the newsstands. But most Yiddish dailies did not follow this model. In fact, the larger Yiddish dailies in New York and Warsaw generally shied away from what were called Kiddush Levona oisias, or large font headlines, in connection to minor reports of local crimes and scandals. While the New York papers did sometimes have them on the articles on their front page, they were often below the fold and camouflaged by inserting them together with a variety of other news stories. And I can just show you a couple of examples of this. This is just one page from, I think, it's from September 19th, 1907. You could see 7,000 furriers on strike. The bride came out from under the chuppah with a different groom. Night schools are open for applications. Millionaires lived with 2 men for 10 years. 25 people killed in a train wreck. They wanted to hang a motorman in Little Italy. The thieves were robbed. With babes in arms, French women protest their president. So you could see the kind of different types of articles that range from kind of sensationalistic, wild stories to, typical newspaper stories that you expect. And there's really kind of a fascinating mix, in order to keep the reader interested. Now, notably, the 2 leading Yiddish dailies in Warsaw, Heint and Moment, had special sections for materials of a scandalous nature on page 3 of weekday editions and on page 11 of the larger Friday papers. These sections frequently contained material that could be deemed sensationalistic, but were always hidden in the interior of the papers. And I can just show you what these looked like as well. So this is the column, or the page, Das Leben in Warsaw, Life in Warsaw. This is from Moment. And you could see official kashrut agency finally created in Warsaw. Scandals of the unemployed. Will Jews be forced to abstain from work on Sundays? Mystery suicide in a hotel. She took her own life on account of an argument with a man and almost took 5 others with her. What Director Koschke told the representatives of the Craftsman Union: 3-year-old girl falls out of a window. Then this one is Was Herzach in Warsaw, like what do you hear in Warsaw? This is from Heint, the other major daily in Warsaw. 4 terrible robberies in one night. An original swindler wearing a sergeant's uniform. Robbery of a fur warehouse worth 36,000 zlotys. 70-year-old Jew dies after being run over by a tramway. Tragic car crash at the opening of the Poniatowski Bridge. 5 children in Warsaw paralyzed. Director of the Fund for the Sick quits. Man wearing only a kittel runs around Warsaw claiming ghosts are after him. So some of these, you can see that the Warsaw newspapers don't have as many kind of wild stories as the New York papers have, but they do occasionally have some. Now, long a popular feature in many urban newspapers, these sections typically featured brief and sometimes lurid local stories of crime and transgression, and functioned as what was essentially a Yiddish crime blotter. As Jews poured into urban areas, and as the Yiddish press developed and professionalized, journalists and editors imitated what they saw around them in their industry. This meant reporting on Jews involved in all manner of transgressive activity, a task that Yiddish journalists were well situated to perform. But the Yiddish crime blotter, known popularly as der Chronik, or the Chronicle, didn't only report on crime. It also contained a variety of stories, some outrageous or scandalous stories of local interest, some of a criminal nature, others not. Both Heint and Moment sections included explosive little blurbs that peered into broken lives, eavesdropping and reporting on events that perhaps may not have been so appropriate for public consumption, but which the reading public eagerly devoured. In a 1928 article in the Warsaw daily Unser Express, which discussed the intense popular interest in newspapers, one Yiddish journalist wrote the following, quote, "As usual, when I got the paper yesterday, I jumped straight to the Chronik. I like to know what's happening in the city." End quote. This is one indication that for many readers, these sections, although they were in the back pages of the papers, appear to have been popular destinations. The popular Chronik section made its appearance early on, showing up sporadically in Das Jiddische Volksblatt, an 1880s-era weekly out of St. Petersburg. But this paper's chronicle dealt mainly with news of Jewish organizational life, not crime reports or unusual events of any kind. There was nothing sensationalistic about it. Similarly, Der Freund, the Russian Empire's first Yiddish daily, which was founded in 1903, had an occasional chronicle section that also dealt with the affairs of the communal elite. When the newspaper moved to Warsaw in 1908, there was, and I just want to add that this newspaper was kind of the first attempt to create a serious newspaper of record in Yiddish. But when they moved to Warsaw, their Chronik page began to reflect local interest and grew into its own little section. A popular chronicle of crime and scandal that would come to appear in all Warsaw Yiddish dailies, it lasted through to World War II. Operating on the understanding that scandal and sensation sells papers, even if it doesn't appear on the front page, the reporters of the Yiddish press mined all kinds of sources for this fare. Street peddlers, bums and bag ladies, doctors and nurses at the Jewish hospital, the police, rabbis, neighborhood finks, and anyone else who might be able to give them the lowdown or on whatever crime or scandal that had just transpired in the vicinity. Local Jewish do-gooders and blabbermouths were a dime a dozen, standing at the ready not only to tell all, but possibly to make some of it up as well. It was the job of Yiddish journalists to suss out which of their sources told them the most accurate or possibly the most interesting version, all with the knowledge that a variation on the same story might appear in a competing paper that could check and balance their own story. The ability of Yiddish journalists to coax these strange stories out of their lowly sources was legion, and dependent on part on the Jewish chattering classes, who may or may not have been forthcoming. Although it seems remarkably common, loquacity among the Jews is another phenomenon that has not been adequately addressed. Scholars, on the one hand, have long argued that Jewish culture is a text-bound culture. There's certainly a truth to that. There is, however, on the other hand, Jewish culture is also very much a talking culture. There isn't really such thing as a vow of silence among Jews, religious or otherwise. There exists a stereotype of a talkative, persuasive, argumentative Jew, a matter with at least a grain of truth in it as well. It was thus among the garrulous lower classes of Jews of Warsaw that reporters found some of their best sources. The rendering of their speech into prose is one of the great joys of reading the Yiddish press, which it is worth pointing out was the only place that Yiddish speakers served as resources for reporters. Now, what does fill up the Chronik is a plethora of different topics, many of them rarely considered and practically untouched by modern scholarship. The stories touch on a huge number of issues involving urban Jewish populations, among them superstition, petty theft, smuggling, homosexuality, love affairs, poverty, prostitution, and gambling, to name just a few. While these are the troubling details of daily life in once vibrant communities, they nonetheless reveal aspects of the Jewish urban underclass, a large segment of the Jewish population that has largely gone unnoticed in historiography. Now, one of the major threads that weaves its way through the Chronik is violence, a form of conflict resolution that was endemic in poor Jewish neighborhoods in the Jewish quarters of New York, and an ancillary to George Jurgen's previously mentioned definition of sensational as the timeless appeal of sex, crime, and tragedy. The Yiddish papers of the 1920s and 30s are full of reports of Jew-on-Jew violence, attacks that took place between all kinds of Jews and for a wide variety of reasons. And I can read you a few examples. This one is from Heint from February 1926. The title is Horrible Love Tragedy on 9 Solna Street. Early yesterday, a horrible drama played out at 9 Solna Street. Bela Schwarzkopf, a 26-year-old cleaning woman, has worked for a number of years in the house of the fruit vendor, David Vaden. Avram Wasserstand, a 35-year-old carpenter who is married and has 5 children, but who is having a love affair with Schwarzkopf, frequently used to visit her there. During the past few months, Ms. Schwarzkopf met someone else and became engaged to him. This upset Wasserstein terribly, and he decided to get revenge. Yesterday at 8:30 a.m., Wasserstein entered Waden's home, grabbed Schwarzkopf, and in spite of her resistance, dragged her to the stairs and, after a struggle, threw her out of a third-story window. But Schwarzkopf held fast onto her attacker, who was dragged down with her. Schwarzkopf fell onto the sidewalk and was badly wounded in the head. Wasserstein tried to grab onto a first-floor window frame, but it broke and he fell directly onto Schwarzkopf. Both were unconscious and brought to the hospital in critical condition. That's a terrible story. There's no getting around it, but exciting to read if you're not in the story. I'll give you another example. This is from August 1927 from the Daily Moment. Headline is "Bloody Battle with Human Victims in a Slaughterhouse in Praga." Praga is a neighborhood north of Warsaw. Battles in the Praga slaughterhouse on Namiestnikowska Street have become a regular event. Not long ago, a meat packer was killed, and more bloody scenes have just occurred. Yesterday in the slaughterhouse at 1 a.m., a fight related to business competition broke out between Jewish delivery men and butchers. The delivery fee for delivering a side of beef from the slaughterhouse to the customer is 4 zlotys and is paid for by the butcher. In the meantime, rogue delivery men began to arrive and started carrying the sides for only 2 zlotys. This led to arguments and later on violence. First they fought with their hands, and afterwards they used more multi-purpose items. Delivery man Meir Sandaj of 23 Krochmalna Street pulled out a knife and wounded 35-year-old butcher Benjamin Turek in the stomach. Just after that, an unknown assailant who managed to disappear pulled out a revolver, shot a few times, and wounded 27-year-old delivery man Mordechai Gips, who was working for Turek. Gips was wounded in the chest and in his right hand. Chaos ensued in the slaughterhouse. The police arrived, as did emergency services, which, after bandaging Gips' wounds and taking him to the Praga hospital, took Turek home. Sandaj was arrested. This is from January 18th, 1928, also from Moment, Warsaw Yiddish Daily. This is entitled, "At a bris at the Porosover Rebbe's, the Zvoliner Rebbe is beaten and thrown out." Yesterday at 8:30 p.m., the offices of Moment were alerted by numerous residents of 22 Tvarda Street who informed us that blood was being spilled in the home of the Porosover Rebbe. And the Porosover Rebbe is a relatively well-known Hasidic Rebbe. Our staff writer, upon arriving at the scene, was forced to report the following unfortunate details. The Porosover Rebbe lives in a large first-floor apartment with his family on 22 Tvarda Street in the second courtyard. 8 days ago, the Rebbe's wife, Perele, gave birth to a son, and yesterday's bris was prepared for with gusto. The bris was an impressive affair. The guests included many rabbis and Hasidic Rebbes who live in Warsaw, among them the Kolebieler and the Zvoliner. Although they recently reconciled, the Kolebieler and the Porosover Rebbes, Although they had recently reconciled, at one time there had been a sharp dispute between the Kolebieler and the Porosover Rebbes. As a symbol of their friendship, the Porosover Rebbe even honored the Kolebieler Rebbe by asking him to be the son's godfather. The Porosover Hasidim, however, turned up their noses, asking how could this be, but they couldn't dispute their Rebbe's decision. During the festivities at the Rebbe's table, the crowd became quite exuberant. Wine poured like water, and the guests got very drunk. Meanwhile, when it came time to say the blessings, the Porosover Rebbe, surprisingly, had to wait for his Hasidim to join him. As he had done previously, he again honored the Kolebieler Rebbe with the opportunity to make a blessing. It was at this point that the patience of the Porosover Hasidim ran out, and when the Kolebieler Rebbe sang out with the words, "Rabboi Sai, Mirveln Benchen," "Gentlemen, let us make a blessing," the drunken Porosover Hasidim all began laughing loudly. But when a certain Porosover Chosid began singing the HaRachmanis, the Zvoliner Rebbe's son commented, "It's more appropriate to laugh at your singing than at the Kolebieler Rebbe's blessing." With that, Avremele Cohen yelled out, "Quiet, brat, shut your mouth." The Zvolina Rebbe lost control of himself upon hearing his son insulted as if he were a squeaky shoe. He told Avremele Cohen that if he didn't stop insulting his son, he would get punched twice. Avremele Cohen, who was extremely drunk, shot back, "And you'll get punched 4 times. Hearing how Cohen insulted his father, the Zvolina Rebbe's son honored Avremele Cohen with 2 blazing punches. More was not needed. The crowd was already warmed up and jumped on the Zvolina Rebbe and his son and began to beat them mercilessly. The screams and howls were so inhuman that the other residents of 22 Tvarda Street came running into the apartment when they heard the cries for help. Rushing into the Rebbe's apartment, they found the Zvolina Rebbe and his son in a terrible state. Their clothes were torn to shreds, and they were unable to move. And if that weren't enough, the 2 pummeled men were thrown out of the building, and only with the help of passers-by were they put into a car and taken home. Naturally, the party continued as if nothing had happened. After the 2 were thrown out, the merrymaking continued and the dancing went on. The daughter of the Zvolina Rebbe has informed us that her father will be bringing a suit in a court of law. The news of this event, which spread like wildfire through the Jewish community, has made a deep impression. So, why are these news blurbs important? What do they add to the historical record? What do they tell us about their subjects and the venues in which they appeared? In one regard, the Yiddish newspaper was a place where Jews were not conceived of as the other or as exotic. The Yiddish press opens a window on everything one could and couldn't imagine Yiddish-speaking Jews doing, all within the context of their own culture. The best and worst of everything appears in its pages, from the highest levels of literature, philosophy, politics, and science, to the lowest levels of crime, tragedy, and inept stupidity. All of it smuggled into the Yiddish press in tiny convulsive news blurbs, and all to the absolute delight of its readers. When it came to the novelties of reporting on Jewish life in big cities, even the Yiddish journalists understood that they were onto something interesting. A 1932 article in the Warsaw daily Unser Express took notice of the plethora of headlines in its own pages that were exposing the previously unknown goings-on in the city's nightlife. And some of these included, "A secret gambling den has been uncovered with a roulette wheel and baccarat. Arrests made after lesbian nightclub discovered. A secret narcotics den was uncovered, opium and cocaine found." These go on and on. The list of urban Jewish subterranean enterprise continues. And while none of it is the stuff of what most people think of as Jewish history, it's all there in black and white and Yiddish. Now, whether or not it is conceived of as sensationalism, reportage on Jews living in early 20th century urban settings has a historical value that has barely been explored, and yet we should consider ourselves lucky that Yiddish journalists had the foresight to record it. What it shows is that Yiddish journalists participated in a particular aspect that existed and continues to exist in their industry. The publication of sensationalistic stories in Yiddish newspapers provides us with a distinctly Jewish version of this phenomenon, one that reveals unusual and often thrilling stories about Jews in often difficult situations, which sometimes occur connected to distinctly Jewish cultural matters, but which is always reported on from within a Jewish journalistic context. Literary scholarship has long dominated Yiddish studies, sometimes to the detriment of other aspects of Yiddish culture. But as Israel Joshua Singer once wrote, good journalism is also good literature. Moreover, so-called low-quality or sensationalistic journalism is also a form of literature. And if we're willing to look at Shund as a distinct Yiddish cultural product, then Yiddish journalism should also hold a valued place in Yiddish studies. Moreover, the unbuttoned characters reported on by Yiddish journalists also deserve a place in both the historical record and as a distinct cultural, sociological, and journalistic phenomenon. Thank you. Happy to take questions if you have them.
Thank you so much. It was very fun. I am not Jewish, therefore I don't know so much. But I have two questions. When the readers wrote the letter and asked about the 5,000, what was the answer? Because that is interesting. And then another question, what happened with those newspapers and those stories after the Second World War?
Okay, so the response to the man who wrote this letter is a sort of equivocating response. They didn't want to embarrass this person by saying, you know, what you believe is not true. So they sort of divided into, you know, a religious calendar versus a you know, earthly calendar. And so that's sort of how they parse it to this person. And it's they actually write a fairly long response to him, which is nice because they took it seriously. They understood that this reader's question was probably on the minds of a lot of readers. And so this is why they provided a fairly extensive response, which included, why studying the natural sciences was important. So that, this is all part of their kind of educational plan to, bring news of the outside world to the kind of cloistered world of the Jewish shtetl, these sort of small towns in which they lived in Eastern Europe.
But wouldn't people become upset that someone talks, some newspaper talks against that 5,000?
There were certainly people who were upset, but they didn't have the power to, stop these newspapers from publishing. The people who published these newspapers were generally funded by wealthy people, or they were themselves were wealthy. In fact, the man who published Kolma Wasser made a lot of money in women's wear. And so he used that money he owned a few different newspapers and he funded them on his own. And also with colleagues who were part of this movement that was called the Haskalah. It's sort of a Jewish Enlightenment movement, the idea of which was to sort of educate the Jews of the Pale in a modern way. And yes, there was certainly, conflict and pushback against this type of, this policy. But eventually it sort of won out. But also to answer your question about what happened in World War II, it was all destroyed. It all ends in the fall of 1939.
Did it come back again after?
No, because, after World War II, the vast majority of Jews of this region have been murdered. In those that were able to survive in the Soviet Union are restricted to Soviet Yiddish culture, which really comes to an end after World War II, to a large degree. And in Poland, you do have, in the immediate aftermath of World War II, a Yiddish newspaper, but everything at this point is under Soviet control and state-run and censored, and so the atmosphere and production and product is completely different than it was.
Thank you, Eddy. This was brilliant.
Thank you.
So I want to, and plus it makes me want to read this again. We should read some Yiddish in the lane.
We should.
Actually, I will say that in Yiddish classes that I've taught, it's a blast to read this stuff. It really is. It's really fun.
Yeah, and all these English words. I mean, in the American.
Well, in the American papers, yeah, you have that.
Or Polish words.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I do have a question, which is, how does this compare, I mean, the Yiddish journalistic sensationalism with what, I don't know, American, New York, kind of the New York press?
I mean, it varies. I mean, what you have is, and also I didn't really mention this, but it varies according to time period. So from, I would say, the very early 20th century up through the end of World War I, this is sort of like a golden era of sensationalism. Post-World War I, it begins to decline, although it depends on the newspaper. So for instance, in a newspaper like Der Taube, which sort of fancied itself an intellectuals paper, you have significantly less material like this. In the Morgenfreiheit, which was the communist newspaper, but also a very well-written, highly literary paper, you don't have a lot of material like this. It really remains to newspapers like the Vorwärts, Yiddish's Tageblatt, and I'm forgetting the name of it. There's another one. I'm blanking on the name, but it's really a phenomenon. It's really a sort of pre-World War I phenomenon when this stuff is really coming out in droves, and so you have different New York newspapers that do similar things. So, I mean, obviously the New York Times is not doing it, but there are other newspapers that do, and so these are the tabloid papers. The New York World does it. The New York American does it. The Hearst papers do it, and the Hearst papers are famous for it. I mean, Pulitzer's New York World is also famous for it. But they, as we get more and more into the 20th century, they begin to, it begins to wane, and what you wind up with are real tabloids that, with like the New York Post. That, in fact, the title of this talk, "Headless Body Found in Topless Bar," it's from the New York Post. It's a very famous headline. Those are the papers that really sort of take over this phenomenon of sensationalistic stories. So in Warsaw, you have a different structure for it. So these stories don't appear on the front pages. They appear in the interior of the paper in this special section that I described. And through the entire interwar period, these stories appear. But you also have the phenomenon of what are called afternoon papers. And the afternoon papers, like Warsaw Radio or Heintekenias, and even the Bund had its own tabloid paper. And so the stories that I read are, sometimes funny and odd. The ones in these real tabloids, in these afternoon papers, are just completely wild, and you can tell a lot of them are fabricated, but they're really fun to read. And it's also interesting to find out, what was your average Jew in Warsaw reading, during the 1920s and 30s. Like this was, these are the papers they'd pick up. This is their leisure reading. This is, something enjoyable and fun and entertaining. And, it sort of reflects an interest on the part of this readership of, I did my graduate work with, David Roski's, and from David Roski's perspective, Yiddish literature is a high literature. It's it is. There's a fantastic, brilliant, high, beautiful, belles lettres in Yiddish. But that's not what I work with. I became much more interested in sort of, what's the daily, scandal? What are these people reading? What would have been memorable to average people in this time? That's sort of what became interesting for me, and that's what I ended up focusing on. I don't know if that answers your question adequately.
Yeah, I mean, right. It just raises the question to me on what they pattern themselves on, right? Whether it's on the other. If it's a sort of phenomenon that's clear, then
right. This is a phenomenon that exists in all presses, and everywhere you go. Not all papers do it, but there is typically, in a large city, at least a number of tabloids that, that engage in this kind of journalism. Anybody else?
So this is sort of piggybacking on that. The really hyper local gossip. Like Mrs. Greenberg's affair with this other guy. It's not like tabloids that we think of now, which are about public figure scandals.
Right.
And so I guess I'm wondering if there was some sort of, aside from the sales potential, if there's a way that there was permission to publish this type of gossip because it's in Yiddish, and so in that way it's just for Yiddish readers and protects Jews from embarrassment.
Right, it doesn't completely protect them. Now, one of the things I often say is that the Yiddish press is kind of like a private conversation. There are certainly, especially in Warsaw, but also in New York and in other places, there were Gentiles who could speak Yiddish because they had all kinds of dealings with Jews, and these are languages they picked up as anybody else would, but they typically couldn't read it. So, things that appeared, scandalous material that appeared in Yiddish newspapers, was generally, kind of remained in the Jewish sphere. But there are instances, in particular in Warsaw, where scandals kind of break the linguistic barrier and will wind up in Polish newspapers. And on more than one occasion, depending on the scandal, I have seen comments in the Yiddish newspapers that say, the Polish newspapers are already talking about this, we need to bring this to an end. And so there is a recognition that this is embarrassing, and they kind of shut it down.
You mentioned at the beginning that this is a kind of a space where Jews do not have to be the other, and that this is the world of Yiddish speakers and all the various things that they have done. So you've just talked about this breaking the linguistic barrier. So how often are these stories, about non-Jews? How often does it come in the other side in order to engage with what are the scandals going on in the Polish-speaking press, or what are interesting stories that our sources told us that actually just had nothing to do,
right,
with Yiddish speakers? Right.
So that's a phenomenon you find more in the American Yiddish papers. There's a closer connection to, here's an interesting story in, whatever, the New York Tribune, let's steal it.
Right.
And
that millionaires with the two husbands.
Right, exactly. So the bigger scandals that occur in New York, but also in Warsaw, will wind up in those papers. But I also think, to a certain degree, in Warsaw, and I think this also occurs in New York, people read more than one paper a day. And sometimes people read a Polish newspaper and a Yiddish newspaper. And so you kind of get all the news that way. So, in the Chronique, in this special section, most of the news appears to be about Jews. Occasionally you have a story that's not. Occasionally there are a lot of anti-Semitism stories also that involve anti-Semites most of whom are not Jewish. But it's a phenomenon that, it's almost as if this page is for us, and it's our stories, and occasionally, other people make their way in if it's interesting enough, but the bulk of it is really, news about Jews.
A question about the journalists. Maybe this is more about the American Yiddish press, but were these articles bylined? Right, because bylines are sort of a hallmark of yellow journalism of the late 19th century. And if this is happening within this cloistered private conversation, what are the implications of these articles being bylined or not?
They're typically not. So in New York, they're almost never bylined. In Warsaw, they are occasionally bylined by initials. So sometimes you can figure out who they are. So just as an example, and I didn't discuss it here, but it's in my book, Bad Rabbi, if it's something that interests you. There's a chapter on scandals in the Warsaw Rabbinical Court, of which there were many, and these were frequently reported on in these columns. And so sometimes you'll see initials that are just the initial B or Bet or B, and sometimes you'll see Yud Bet. And Yud Bet is either Yitzchak Bashevis or Yitzchak Bornstein. And it's more like Yitzchak Bornstein was another reporter who did a lot of different kind of reporting, a lot of sports reporting, but it's well known that Isaac Bashevis Singer, Yitzchak Bashevis, or Yud Bet, he did report. It was not only did he report from the Warsaw Rabbinical Court, but his brother did as well. And his brother had a regular column in the Vorwärts in New York as a reporter from Poland. And so those were all byline. And he does, in fact, have a number of reports from the Warsaw Rabbinical Court under that byline in the Vorwärts. But Isaac Bashevis also, he wrote his autobiography based on the conceit of his father's rabbinical court. So, and this is, so, you know, these rabbinical court reports were extremely popular to the point where there were cabaret shows about them. I mean, they're out of control. It's basically like the Jewish Jerry Springer show. They're really wild. And they were really popular. And so you can understand why there's interest in this sort of thing. And it's also, what's fascinating is it's like a very uniquely Jewish affair, you know, the rabbinical court. I mean, obviously there are different courts. I mean, you could probably do it from some other religious courts, you know, but these, you know, the events occur in Yiddish, you know, with religious figures and common people in an official capacity, and they're really, and actually just like, you know, today in journalism and always you have court reporters. The Yiddish press in Warsaw had rabbinical court reporters. The editors always sent reporters to the rabbinical court because they knew something, you know, was going to explode there, because, you know, it was typically divorce cases, and, you know, people are upset and angry. So, you know, they usually break down and something terrible happens. And for readers, that's entertainment.
Yes, I had a question. So the stuff that you were talking about, like from Eastern Europe, is mostly falls within the Pale of Settlement.
It does until 1917.
Okay. Yeah, but I'm just curious how that kind of transferred to America. Like, were people because the Pale Settlement is like Russia, Poland, like were like Romanian Jews, for example, like, 'cause there wasn't that much of a, or as much of like a thriving Jewish press culture in some of those other places.
I mean, do you mean Yiddish newspapers in Romania?
Well, like Jews from non-Pale, like Yiddish-speaking Jews from not the Pale.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in addition, you know, Yiddish newspapers that existed in, you know, areas outside the Pale, whether parts of Galicia or wherever, they report on things the same way that these newspapers do as well.
So I'm noticing that in all of these theatrical news stories, that the theater ads are on this page as well.
Right.
And is that in the circus too? I don't know, is art imitating life or what?
Look, I mean, you know, it may well be that theater ads were placed on this page because the people who, you know, depending on the type of play, you know, the people who read this, who were apt to read these kinds of reports, were also apt to go to a particular kind of theater. I can add that these pages also contained a certain amount of sports reporting, and in addition, reports from wrestling matches. That was also something that was very popular.
I'm curious if there are, in any of the newspapers, correspondence from, say, New York, writing from or about a different center, like Warsaw or something, so you're reporting on this other group that's maybe sort of like us or maybe sort of not like us.
Oh, yeah.
Always looking inward at your own community.
Right. So on this particular page, you know, it's almost all local. Like that's the intention of this rubric. And elsewhere in the newspapers, you will have, you know, reports on, you know, important Jewish goings on in, you know, Moscow, New York, wherever. That was a very common feature of the Yiddish press in general, especially in New York. You know, they'll, in the Vorwärts or other Yiddish newspapers, they'll have, you know, stories about Jewish communities in Morocco or Algeria or Palestine or wherever. And that was actually very common. There was always a lot of interest in what Jews around the world were doing, because they understood, they recognized themselves as sort of diaspora community connected to other diaspora communities. And so that was really a very common feature.
Okay, so you end with this kind of call for action for people to pick up these stories and to kind of reframe our narratives of work in more press, not just focus on Yiddish literature, make this corrected within Yiddish studies. And I think it's a point very well taken. And as you say, that there's more and more interest in studying Shund within literature programs, and in some ways that this is parallel to it. So I think I have two questions. One, since your book has came out, have you noticed anyone take you up on this bait in general of looking into the kind of the downwardly mobile Jewish class and studying these narratives? And two, what are do you think we have the kind of technical infrastructure now needed to kind of support this large scale study? I remember you and I talked before, and you explained you went through every single microfilm all the time in order to be able to uncover these things. So do we have the tools we need to better facilitate this type of scholarship?
As for the second part of that, I'm not entirely sure. A lot of this material, it's like since I started this research, a lot of it has become digitized. And there is a type of OCR that does work sort of. It doesn't work particularly well. And this is obviously connected in some ways to the poor reproduction of Yiddish newspapers. A lot of the digitized material is taken from microfilms, which itself sometimes wasn't done very well. And so that's obviously problematic. So it's difficult to, if you're doing word searches, it's not an easy thing. Sometimes you get sometimes you wind up with information, sometimes you don't. So I would say that the technological framework is not yet in an ideal state where we can, really seek out things like this. But I think eventually it'll happen. It just takes time. Will it happen in my lifetime? Maybe. I don't know. And as far as the first part of your question, I think there are some people that kind of have taken the bait. I know that I have friends and colleagues that have used my book in classes, and it's been of interest to students working on projects. Some people have told me that their students have latched onto specific stories. I know that this isn't really, I guess, academic work, but Annie Polland, who runs the Tenement Museum, did some programs on psychics, and in my book I have a number of stories about Jewish psychics from the early 20th century. And there is a woman, after I published a story on this Jewish murderer of the 1870s named Pesach Rubenstein, a woman wrote her dissertation on the phenomenon, and it's great. It's really interesting. So, I think there's some interest, and if people, when people choose topics to do research in, they have to like it. I can't really say, you should do this. But, I can say that, but, they may not, they, might rightly ignore me. I don't know. But, it depends. It really depends on how, in graduate school, is this material still framed through a high literary lens? That's really the question. And if that's the case, students can sort of go with that flow and remain in that fold, or that they can react to it and say, I guess as I did, and sort of take the opposite tack and focus on Shund or on materials like this.
There are different ways in this corpus that the kind of journalists themselves become the story, or that the newspapers write about other newspapers, or that they write about other media. I feel like that's such a kind of drumbeat in our own media, that our media is always writing about media. That's
right.
The biggest topic. And this seems like I don't see any media.
So you won't see it on this page. So this page, like I said, is relegated really to local events and scandal. There is a lot of, sniping between papers. And so, you also have to remember that this is during a time when print culture is king. Radio in the United States doesn't really become a phenomenon until the second half of the 1920s. So, print culture is everything. And so you do have, many instances I could think of in summer of 1913, a blurb appears in Heint, which is the most popular newspaper in Warsaw. And the blurb says that Hillel Zeitlin, who is one of the competing newspaper's most popular columnists, says that he was seen in a train station in Pinsk eating a pork chop. So this is a totally fabricated story, but it causes a gigantic scandal. And so what happens is you have, writers in Moment, the competing paper, where Zeitlin, I should just add, is he used to work for Heint, but then left in 1911 to help found Moment. So the editor of Heint, Shmuel Yatskan, hates him. He's like a blood enemy. And so, this is his attempt to cut him down to size, in public. And so, when the blurb appears, all of these articles appear in Moment saying, this is a complete lie. Zeitlin wasn't even in Pinsk at this time, and we have witnesses to prove it. And then the next day in Heint, you have, articles saying not only was he seen eating a pork chop in a train station in Pinsk, but he's known to write on Shabbos and on Yom Kippur and eats on Yom Kippur. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and it ends up, you end up with the situation that I described earlier, where they say the Polish press is starting to talk about this. We have to shut it down, and they shut it down. The scandal becomes too embarrassing for the community, and so they end up. But so that's just one instance of newspapers attacking one another. In New York, you have the Vorwärts and the Freiheit, always at each other's throat. They're accusing each other of being anti-Semites. It's really a lot of fun if you're doing research and reading this material, because it really it opens a window on these sort of intercommunal disputes that are often political but frequently also personal, because all of these people know each other. And so it's really shines a light on aspects of Yiddish culture that I think that most people don't really. I mean, people know, scholars know about them, but they don't see them as important in any way. But they were important, especially to readers. Readers sided with these papers. They were beholden to the paper they read. And, if Hillel Zeitlin got attacked, in fact, not only that, there are Moment published pages and pages of signatures of people who would testify that Hillel Zeitlin, was an upstanding Jew and would never have done any of these things. It's an amazing phenomenon.
Yeah, I'm also curious because I'm it was kind of touched upon earlier, just kind of because I would assume that the people working for the papers were a little bit more I don't know, had sort of less maybe traditional views than maybe the people reading the papers. I'm curious if that I mean I know that you gave that example of the 8,000 to 10,000-year-old sequoia.
Right.
But I don't know, did that ever was there ever that sort of clash of
of tradition and modernity
between the readership and the author, especially I'm curious about New York, or maybe by that point people were just the world was different.
I mean, you had certain papers appealed to different kinds of readers. So the Vorwärts that I talked about before was a socialist paper, and there were certain unions that were connected to it. And so that was frequently read by, the people who were part of that community. The Freiheit, which is the communist newspaper, had a communist readership. But you also had the Morgenjournal. The Morgenjournal was considered an orthodox paper. And so, I mean, certainly there were people who read, more than one paper because they wanted to get who maybe they liked a particular writer or poet or whatever. But, in sort of the grand scheme of things, you did have readers who were sort of politically and socially oriented reading certain papers. So in Warsaw, you have Heint, which is a Zionist paper. You have Moment, which is, it started out as the folkist paper, but sort of was a little bit broader than that. And this was a different political party. And you also had the Volkszeitung, which was the Bundist, or the socialist newspaper. So, you know, papers often represented distinct communities. And so, you know, if you read, let's say, the Morgenjournal, which was the Orthodox paper, or, you know, sort of perceived as the Orthodox paper, you know, you might complain about the Morgenfreiheit, or, you know, gripe about the Vorwärts, and because it was, you know, it had material in it that you found lurid or offensive or, you know, problematic in some way.
At that time, I understand that there was no problem with the invasion of privacy because they just named people.
Yes.
Then I understand those who didn't have the economical mean to do something. But for instance, that millionaire or people who were rich, when they saw that their name was in the newspaper, did they anything against the newspaper or something?
It's an interesting question. I don't think so, because you always see names in papers. You not only do you see names, but you see addresses. They were not, you know, and you could show, not only that, this is interesting. So all of these papers had bureaus that were open during certain times of the day where you could just walk in off the street and tell them what you felt was a newsworthy story. So if your neighbor annoyed you and you wanted to make something up about them, you could go to the editors of one of these papers and tell them tell them the story. And, you know, they would probably go and check it out. But, you know,
Maybe not.
But they might not. It's you know, it's not really clear. But you know, I think that even, I mean, people of means, people who are wealthy, I think there were probably circumstances where they could pay to keep their names out of the paper. But if that actually is the case, we didn't see their names in the paper, so we don't know. But, you know, to a certain degree, the Yiddish papers were kind of like the Wild West. They would print your name, they would print your address, they didn't care. Occasionally, they don't, but usually they do.
The other newspaper, not Yiddish, did they do also the same?
Sometimes, yeah. I mean, depending on, you know, where and when. But it was, not all newspapers did it, but, you know, a certain type of newspaper did.
It was very fun.
Thank you. All right. Thanks so much.